I find that quite objectionable. It's an entirely honest thing to do. It's, we haven't set that out. The government has not decided that we want this to be the answer. We've gone away to an independent group of experts. They're acknowledged not just within the UK, but across an international field, having real expertise in this field, to provide us with an objective base, not just for the harm to be avoided and the health gain to be made, but the impact on different groups of drinkers. It is entirely honest to present that as the average impact on that group of drinkers. You're setting up something that says if there are people at the extreme, it's not honest to then present an average and an overall impact, and I just do not accept that.
I think it's right that we question this, and it is a matter of perception. It is something.
It is not a matter of perception.
No, excuse me.
It is not a matter of perception. If you want to take extremes, then you're setting something else out there. You're setting up a straw man to knock down. Okay.
There is a clear perception amongst witnesses who gave evidence to this committee, either orally or in writing, that there needs to be a lot more convincing done that the cost for a moderate drinker is likely to be as low as £3 a year extra.
I don't think it's helpful to set up straw men to knock down and give credence to that form of view, rather than look at the overall impact and having some honesty and actually understanding the evidence that's been given and the independent evaluation reports that's been provided. If the evidence from Sheffield had said something different, we may well not be here, because we may not have been able to make out and to understand that this legislation could have had the public health gain that we think it will do. And, we're not alone in that. Other jurisdictions right across the world are looking at this piece, and, of course, Scotland have already proceeded. We know there's interest in the Republic of Ireland too, and other jurisdictions too. So this is an issue for lots of countries in the world, including Wales, and I'm very proud that we are prepared to take this measure in Wales, and I look for support for people across parties looking at the evidence and not looking at anecdotes and extremes.
Okay, moving on.
Yep, and I won't apologise for being personally doubtful of that £3 a year figure. Because of the perceptions that people have, there will need to be an educating process. There will have to be a communications process. The explanatory memorandum sets out an estimated £100,000 in communication costs required for Welsh Government, including £80,000 for publicising the change to businesses and £20,000 for a public communication campaign. Is that enough?
It's comparable with the sort of communications we've undertaken in other pieces of legislation. For example, the Public Health Wales Act that we passed in this term had an estimated £60,000 in the first year, thinking about similar campaigns on implementing smoke-free open spaces. Now, that's objectively reasonable estimate, I think, for the amount that we would need and want. Of course, there's plenty of publicity and interest in the legislation as it goes through. And, if there is a need to do more to better educate the public, we're, of course, able to reconsider that. But I think it's a reasonable basis on which to proceed, yes.
Okay. Final point from me, a final question from me. It's about challenge to the evidence presented in the explanatory memorandum. From Professor John Nelson of Penn State University in the United States. Emeritus Professor of Economics at Penn State University. He describes the evidence presented in the explanatory memorandum as incomplete, selective, misleading, states that some of his own work in this field has been misrepresented. What's your response to that? And in light of that criticism, are you confident that the EM provides a full and accurate representation of the evidence base? And we always look for as wide an evidence base as possible, and this professor's evidence should, I guess, be considered alongside Sheffield.
And to be fair, it has been. His work is referenced in the explanatory memorandum. The explanatory memorandum itself was peer-reviewed by two different academics within the UK as well. And it's pretty clear, and you need to be honest about this. Professor Nelson does not believe that minimum unit pricing will work. So he comes at it saying this is the wrong thing to do. And, he's perfectly entitled to express that view, and it's not as if people aren't aware of the views that he's had, or he's not been in correspondence directly with the government as well. We'll, of course, consider what he has to say, but we actually think that the weight of evidence provided by Sheffield is an entirely real base on which to proceed, and you would be amazed if you reached a decision like this and there was an absolute unanimity within a field of academic experts around the field said this is absolutely the right thing to do around the world. So I don't doubt there'll be people able to provide an answer as this probably isn't the right thing to do, we don't actually do it. But I'm still confident the memorandum is an accurate and real base to proceed. I'm confident in the evidence base Sheffield have provided. And of course, as we proceed through this legislation, should the Assembly agree and pass this piece of legislation, we'll have real live evidence from Scotland. Before we actually introduce our price, we'll have more than a year of minimum unit pricing in Scotland by the time we get around to introducing a regime here in Wales. If the Assembly agrees with us, we can stick to our timetable of July 2019.
Just to be clear, you said you had not been in direct correspondence with the Professor?
Professor Nelson has written directly to the government, yes.
You and have you corresponded then?
Personally,
because it's about testing. It's important to test Sheffield's evidence as much as possible, and that's done, you know, in academic studies by peer review, and I'm interested in what peer review Welsh Government has pursued in relation to
I know you're talking about the expansion memorandum,
Sheffield.
but perhaps on the evidence from Sheffield, I don't know if Janine wants to set out to say something about the peer review process for their work as well.
The University of Sheffield has published several papers around their modelling, not just their Wales modelling, but the modelling they've undertaken for other countries. All of those have been published in high-quality peer-reviewed journals, so they would have been peer-reviewed anonymously by a number of academics. They also have their own steering and advisory group that involves a number of sort of world-renowned academics and experts in the alcohol field, which peer reviews and advises on the approaches they take to their work. But we haven't undertaken peer review of Professor Nelson's work. I mean, it wouldn't be our role to peer review an independent academic's work. It could take a huge amount of resource for us to do that for every academic out there commenting on policy. I mean, we would be looking at it. We have considered his work and included it in the explanatory memorandum. I don't believe that his work has been misrepresented. We will be updating the explanatory memorandum, and we will look at some of the additional references that he has provided and include if necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Symud ymlaen, mae'r cwestiynau nesaf o dan ofal Lynn Neagle.
Chair, the committee's received written evidence that a minimum unit price set beyond 50p would be disproportionate and would go against the spirit of the Supreme Court's judgment on the Scottish legislation. How do you respond to that?
I assume there's no pun intended on going against the spirit, but look, I just don't accept that. I think that's a bit of a red herring. Because we've set out an indicative level. It's fairly easy to explain when set at 50 pence. The formula to calculate the minimum price is quite easy to do then. But we've got more evidence coming in another report from Sheffield that will look at the public health difference in 5 pence increments of 35 pence up to 70 pence. And we'll then need to make a choice about that. And I've indicated before that we'll need to consider the evidence in setting a price. And we also have to think not just about the initial price if we go ahead with this, but what we do to make sure the impact isn't dulled. So, for example, if we have the same minimum unit price for 5 years, as prices rise, the impact will be less. So we'll need to think about all of those things. We're not in introducing a regime, should the Assembly agree, but if we're going to maintain that and maintain the impact we think it will have on health as well. So I don't think it would go against the spirit, far from it. What the Supreme Court actually said was that a minimum unit price is a proportionate manner in which you can achieve a legitimate objective. It is about how you reduce the harm caused by misuse of alcohol.
Okay, thank you.
No pun intended as regards goes against the spirit of, no doubt there, but anyway, carry on, Lynn.
Can you provide some more information on how you intend the internal review of the level of minimum unit price to work? Who will be involved in the process, and will the findings be made publicly available?
Tracy, do you want to say that? It might be helpful when officials explain where we're going to go with that internal process, how we expect to make it available and feed into our considerations moving forward.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I point to make, I suppose, is that we have to allow enough time, obviously, in any internal review for there to have been an impact, and we're expecting it to take a little while for behaviours to change and for indeed the industry to respond to the policy. What we envisage is that internal review will be carried out by Welsh Government policy officials, aided by our analytical expertise in-house, at the 2-year mark after implementation of the bill. And we'll look at a range of factors there, such as alcohol consumption levels at that point, hospital admission data, and the other data really that we've set out in the explanatory memorandum as being the key measures by which we'll measure the impact of minimum pricing.
And we'll also, of course, have evidence from Scotland as well, from their own regime that they would have introduced too. So there'll be lots for us to learn between the two countries.
And is it your intention to make that information available then publicly?
Well, what we would normally do is obviously provide advice at the time to ministers, and there would be an opportunity then to issue a written statement.
I would expect we would expect to provide information about the review and its conclusions and recommendations and how we would or wouldn't take them forward. I think that'd be the right thing to do. We're in a new area of lawmaking and of policy. And I think it'd be the right thing if we signal we're going to have the review, that we then say this is what we've got from it, here's how we're going to respond to it. In addition, of course, to the evaluation at the 5-year point that we've indicated we'll have as well.
Okay, thank you. Can I just move on to guidance now? There's no requirement for guidance on the face of the bill, and we have had various pieces of legislation in this Assembly that have had a requirement for guidance on the face of the bill. And given that the committee's heard that an understanding of the bill's requirements will be key to the success of the policy, can you just tell us a bit more about why you've decided not to place the requirement for guidance on the face of the bill?
Well, the government has a general power to issue guidance. I'm not particularly precious about the drafting in this sense. I know different people have different drafting preferences, both within and outside government. For me, I think it's about, do we get the legislation right? We've indicated that we do expect to issue guidance. There's a debate to be had in the run to stage 2 about whether we want that formally on the face of the bill, about a permissive power to issue guidance or not. But I'm keen not to overcomplicate the face of the bill. And I don't want to get to be too prescriptive what the guidance must or must not be. But we would expect to issue guidance to help a range of people, both those people in the enforcement side of it as well as retailers themselves.
Okay, thank you. The updated Home Office guidance, given the updated Home Office guidance which accompanies the Licensing Act 2003, can you confirm that online purchases of alcohol made from an address in Wales but distributed from England will not be subject to the provisions of the bill?
That's correct, because of the way in which it's defined and where the point of sale is. So it's where the alcohol is, and it's essentially separated and put apart. That's where the sale effectively takes place. Those online sales, if that were the scenario, would not be covered. And again, we're into how people purchase their alcohol and use it and the changing nature of the world. But again, if you're talking about the alcohol we're most interested in, hazardous, harmful drinkers and people who drink very cheap, high-strength alcohol, I'm not aware that there's a huge amount of that alcohol that is being bought by that particular group of drinkers.
Okay, thank you. Just finally then from me, are you confident that the minimum pricing provisions and their application to online sales are sufficiently clear and robust, particularly in relation to cross-border elements?
Yeah, I think actually the law is pretty clear. And the way in which consumers behave, but think where people are and where and how they buy their alcohol. And I do accept that more people are purchasing more things online, including alcohol. But when we look at that group of hazardous and harmful drinkers, about the way in which they behave and how the determined efforts people may or may not make to avoid a minimum unit price, would need to know whether or not that alcohol is being packaged up in England so they could avoid the regime in any event. It would take rather a lot of effort to get there. And actually, the people that we think we're most likely to have the biggest impact on are people who buy alcohol really quite locally. So even, not just about online, but even people getting in their car to go and buy alcohol. Well, actually, if you're prepared to make a cross-border journey, you've got not just the cost of doing that, the fuel and the parking, but you've also got your time as well. And actually, people's time is quite precious to them. So that's why lots of people do buy alcohol in very local settings. And lots of those places sell very cheap alcohol as well. It's not just supermarkets, there's lots of local venues as well. And that's where we think this bill will have the biggest impact. I hope that it might actually change the behaviour of some of the producers too. It's possible that producers will lower the units of alcohol in drinks. It wasn't that long ago that actually a normal strength beer was about 4% or less. It's relatively recently actually that beer and lager has got much stronger in the way people buy it. And actually that could make a difference in terms of the price, but also what then happens with people that consume it as well. So I hope there will be some reconsideration given to the way in which alcohol is produced as well as purchased. And this is part of, not the only way, but part of the way in which we want to change the debate and the way in which people choose to use alcohol. I'm not someone who abstains completely, but we all have choices to make, and this is part of what we want to try and do to avoid alcohol harm in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Symud ymlaen, mae'r cwestiynau nesaf o dan law Julie Morgan.
Diolch. I'm going to be asking about evaluation. And the Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned the fact that the Scottish Act will be there for us to see, and we'll be able to learn from it. And in fact, the Scottish Act does put much more detailed provision about evaluation in the bill, with reference to how particular groups would be affected, you know, by, for example, by gender and those sort of issues. So there's much less detail in this bill about the evaluation process. So I wondered if you could tell us why there's not more detail.
The Scottish Government ended up taking a prescriptive approach on the face of the bill. I think, honestly, that was about getting the bill passed and about dealing with lots of the fears and anxieties people had. I think the problem with that is, if you put it on the face of the bill, whether actually you're not just setting a number of things to consider, but actually whether you're maximising what happens then as well, I'd rather take account of the evidence that we get, not just from Scotland, but from within Wales as well, and how an evaluation covers all those points. And I don't think we can anticipate now what we might choose to do, or we think would be entirely desirable to do, and having that full evaluation in 6 years' time, because we'll not just get to passing the bill, it's 5 years after we introduce a minimum unit pricing regime. So we're talking about, if we introduce minimum unit pricing in July 2019, we were talking about what we do in 2024 in terms of evaluation. And I think our ability to accurately forecast that is something that is not best put on the face of the bill. But we need to make sure the commitments that we give are real and meaningful, and there's proper engagement with stakeholders, not just within this place, but outside, about how to design an evaluation that is meaningful. And again, that's really important to us because it affects the willingness of whoever is the government of the day in the Assembly to continue with a minimum unit pricing regime. So it's not something to be brushed aside. I think we can get away with having a piecemeal or sort of whitewash approach, because that will undermine the confidence of people who will need to vote positively for a continuation of that regime. So I think it is the right thing to do, and we want to learn from what they're doing in Scotland as well. And again, we'll have the opportunity, because they're going through this first, to think about what we do and things that we might want to avoid if we think they're not really desirable in taking the whole scheme through to try and deliver the public health benefit we think is there to be made.
So are you saying that the evaluation will look at things like age, gender and those different characteristics?
Yeah, we'd expect it to look at it.
But you haven't got it on the face of the bill, but you
No.
would expect, because I think that's very important, how it does affect particular groups.
Yeah. Well, we'd certainly want to understand its impact on a different range of groups, and how much evidence is there to allow a robust evaluation and conclusions to be drawn. But we may want to look at more than that as well. So that's why I think getting to a prescriptive list on the face of the bill is not what we want to be, but we want to have a proper conversation before we get into having that evaluation, but what needs to be in there. And then, you know, we'll need to set out transparently the terms of that evaluation before it's done, and then transparently we need to provide the results of that evaluation before Assembly members in the future are asked whether they wish to continue with a minimum unit pricing regime.
Right. And we heard that the Scottish evaluation of the legislation will include a focus on dependent drinkers. So what is your view of that?
Well, again, we want to consider the evidence around that as well, because the legislation isn't set up as having the biggest impact on dependent drinkers. That's part of the understanding that we're not saying that this bill is a silver bullet for all ills when it comes to alcohol-related harm. Dependent drinkers, I think, are in a different category, and some of those may be less price-sensitive about their behaviour. So this is about hazardous and harmful drinkers in particular, We'll have evidence from Scotland because their evaluation will consider the impact on dependent drinkers, and we'll then have an evidence base to consider both in Wales and in Scotland about whether we want our own evaluation to actually consider that as well. So it's not like saying absolutely no, it won't happen, but I think it'd be wrong for me to try and give a definite commitment now that that would absolutely be part of where we want the evaluation to look at. We need to think about the evidence at the time.
Right. And the fact that Scotland is so much more prescriptive, are you saying that they had to do that in order to get support for the bill? Is that what you said earlier on?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reality of getting something done and dusted. And, you know, every government and every person that wants to pass legislation, you make compromises along the way. Whether objectively we think that's the base on which we'd want to proceed, having that level of prescription on the face of the bill, I'm not convinced that would be a sensible place for us to get to. We do want to get to having a proper regime that is understandable, that is supported by people and has safeguards in there. So not just the internal review, but the evaluation we're discussing, and the fact that the Assembly would have to positively vote to maintain the regime after an evaluation is being done. So it isn't just take the word of the government. There will be a proper evidence base for people to make that choice in the future.
Yeah. And we were also told by stakeholders that the evaluation should be independent. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, we would commission an independent evaluation in the same way that government regularly commissions reports. So it isn't that the government would ask itself what it thinks the answer should be. There'd be a brief that would be set out, that would be independently evaluated, and it would be available to Assembly members and the wider public.
Right, so it'd be independent. And what about the effect on children and young people, for example? Would that be a key part of how this
well, again,
will work?
I'd expect that to be considered, yes. Yeah, you know, if you think about the reality of hazardous and harmful drinkers, lots of them are in households with children. So it would be unusual not to think about what impact that has had more broadly, yes.
Yeah. And then lastly, the timescale. We have, you know, had a bit of a discussion about the timescale. Some of the people giving evidence thought 2 years would be early enough to see a change. Have you thought about early monitoring?
Well, we've got the internal review at 2 years, so we're looking at an earlier point before the 5-year evaluation. So we are thinking about different points in time to understand what the evidence is. And whilst we think there is learning taken from Scotland, because, you know, in terms of other parts of the world, you'd have thought that other parts of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, our closest neighbours, the closest culture, are things we could learn from. But we want to have an evaluation that looks again at the impact here in Wales, as opposed to simply reading across from Scotland and Wales automatically. So we've got the internal review that we discussed earlier in Lynn Eagle's questions. We'll make public recommendations from that review about what we'll then do as a result of it. And we'll also have this 5-year independent evaluation as well. So I think that puts us in an entirely reasonable place to make more choices for the future. And, you know, it may well not be me. It may well not be people in this room making those choices at that time. But we want to make sure that a future Assembly is properly equipped to make that choice.
Thank you very much.
OK, Julie. Symud ymlaen nes nawr te, Angela.
Actually, could I just follow on from the questions or answers you gave to both Lynn Eagle and Julie Morgan about the Scottish evidence? Did you at all consider holding back the implementation of this bill until you had seen how it had worked in Scotland and what the rates of success were? Because you've talked a lot about how you'll balance the evaluation and look at what's happened in Scotland. They're implementing their bill, I believe it is 2018. You're looking to implement this bill 2019. Would it not be worth waiting a few years and seeing whether or not it is successful? What's your rationale? Did you consider it? And if not, why not?
Well, Scotland are looking to start their minimum unit pricing regime from the start of May this year. Should the Assembly pass this piece of legislation, we're looking to start a minimum unit pricing regime in July 2019. So there'll be more than a year of practical experience in Scotland before we would start a regime here. I think the danger is if you then say wait another couple of years, you potentially end up just putting aside all the evidence behind the drivers to have this piece of legislation about the public health good you will gain, the alcohol harm you will avoid. And if actually you think that the regime is working and having an impact in Scotland, you then look at, well, why have we waited and had an extra 2 or 3 years of potentially avoidable alcohol-related harm. And if we did that, we'd have to go through another cycle of then deciding again, what is our evidence base for setting a minimum unit price again? And I think we'd actually just shunt the issue into the long grass. I don't think that's the right thing to do. This has been discussed for a very long time. I think it's the right measure to take. I think the timescale for implementation is entirely appropriate, and I certainly don't have any plans to try and push that further back.
Okay. The two areas of real interest I have, the first is about substitution, and I'd like to try and understand what work the Welsh Government has done to particularly address key areas such as young people, to ensure that those who now drink as a relief from life and part of their habits don't then start turning to drugs or increase their use of drugs. We as a committee have actually found it quite hard to get hard evidence about poly use. In fact, we've just had a little bit in from I think it's the Public Health England's National Drug Treatment Monitoring System, and it's the 2017 drug strategy, but it talks about, particularly younger co-users of cannabis and alcohol. I think there's a dearth of evidence, and we've all agreed that, and I just wondered, what have you looked at? What did you find out? Do you have any concerns about the substitution element, costs, etc.? Because we understand actually, I don't know if it comes in a bag. I think it's a bag of spice. Is probably cheaper than, a bottle of White Lightning or whatever it is. Sorry, you can I don't know, does it come in a bag? Doesn't come in a bottle.
Well, I'm impressed by your knowledge of the very cheap white cider end of the market, Angela. You've clearly done your research. Well, look, I think there's a range of different challenges. And what I don't want to confuse is the point and purpose of the bill with other challenges that we know that we have. If I were to say that the point and purpose of this bill is that children and young people who are mixing alcohol and other substance use already, and that this bill will stop that, that would not be the case. That is not the base on which we set out the legislation. It's not the evidence base we have from Sheffield to do this either. We recognise there are other issues about substance misuse more generally. And, if pricing structure changes in one form of substance misuse, then some people already engaged in that field will think about moving into a different area, unless they're already dependent on a particular substance. That brings its own challenges. Part of the challenge with alcohol, though, is that it is generally lawful and freely available in a way that even with unlawful other substances, they're more of them we might want them to be, but actually alcohol in itself is everywhere. And there's a challenge about how easy it is for people to procure that. So this is about trying to do something about the price of alcohol and the recognised harm that it causes. We have different, I think, policy challenges that are not what to try and suggest this bill and the Act that I hope it will become are the vehicle to try and address. We've got the broader substance misuse action that we're taking on trying to educate people to make informed choices and to understand actually the drivers that put people into that field in any event. I don't think trying to say changing the pricing regime for alcohol will resolve issues in families and communities that lead people to consider taking unlawful and hazardous substances in any event. So I just don't want to try and confuse this bill and the problem that you're setting out. That's a different area for the government to try and understand, of course, and that's part of our broader substance misuse action.
I totally understand that, but we are talking about unintended consequences, and I'm sure that every Assembly member, and I know that I can take you to areas in my constituency where you can get wholesale strips and strips and strips of antidepressant drugs for pennies compared to the costs of alcohol even now. And I'm particularly worried about young people because I think that, in some ways they are more vulnerable. And also because of their youth, if we can prevent them from entering a particular pathway, then they've got a better life chance all the way through. So I don't want you just to sort of brush it off, and I'm not really implying that you are, but I think it's really important that we understand the substitution. Now, you talked to Julie Morgan and Lynn about sort of evaluation and monitoring. So will you, when you go forward, will you undertake to actually look at this as a specific area to try to monitor what dangers there could be as an unintended consequence of this bill in terms of substitution? Because, great if we stop people from drinking harmfully, but not great if all we do is drive them down another pathway.
Having made the first point that I don't wish to confuse the objectives of the bill with substitution, We have nevertheless got work ongoing with the Welsh Government's advisory panel on substance misuse to consider the impact of people using different substances and the potential for people substituting one substance with another. We'll expect to have advice from that independent expert group in the coming months, and we'll then have to make choices about what to do with our wider substance misuse action. So there is work ongoing, and we'll obviously consider that if it has an impact on this piece of legislation, but I think that's a broader piece of work that isn't just about this one piece of legislation and its impacts. But I hope that's helpful. I don't try and confuse saying the point of this bill is to deal with substitution. There's a piece
No,
of...
I understand
no, so
that.
I'm not trying to avoid the issue until they try to be helpful about. That isn't the point, but we have a piece of work that is ongoing with the advisory panel. We'll receive that and have to make choices that may affect our view on part of this bill and what we want to do around it, but we'll also have a broader impact, I think, on our substance misuse strategy as well.
Well, that neatly brings me on to my second area of concern, is about the substance misuse strategies and about services that are available. And when you read the consultation responses, almost every consultation response talks about the fact that they believe that there will be greater pressure on the services that provide help for people who have addiction of any form. And what I'd like to understand now is what plans do you have in place to increase the support? Because we can only assume that if, you know, we achieve the consequence we want, which is people give up alcohol or give up harmful behaviours with alcohol, they can't do it in isolation. They need support. What kind of support do you envisage? What are you going to put into place? And have you looked at the funding for that element of it?
Well, we currently provide about £50 million in the substance misuse area. We've not had to make significant cuts to that budget in the past. We'll have to make choices about what happens in that area at present. We think there's capacity for people at present. If there is a significant, because we'll need to think again about how we provide a service. You know, we're trying to protect those frontline services. They're choices that I had to make in this year's budget process in ending some of the joint programmes with the police because we want to protect those frontline services. So there's a commitment to protect those services and the capacity they have to provide real help. But I would much rather have the problem of people who are presenting and seeking help rather than people who are acquiring greater alcohol harm that is not, and they are not presenting to services. We'll then have a better idea about the nature of not just the demand that we have, but how we try and fund it. And none of these things are easy. We're getting a bit into like budget scrutiny again about how we make choices. And the growth in the health budget and the costs it makes in other areas of government policy, but in any event, the fact that demand itself increases in a wide range of areas. But I'd much rather have that as a problem rather than the amount of alcohol-related harm we recognise already exists. So it's not a no, I will never consider it, and no minister will ever consider it, but it is about the capacity we have now, the protection we've provided for frontline substance misuse services, and of course we'll consider that in the future.
But surely that is the point. You know, here we are looking to make a, you know, probably a solid piece of legislation that we really hope is going to make a difference to somebody's life. If that somebody then goes somewhere else to get help to break this cycle that we are trying to break here, and we don't have that support in place, then that truly is a mad situation. Because we're not actually achieving our goals. And, you know, the whole of this bill is predicated on saving the NHS money in the long term, on avoiding ACEs, on, you know, public health outcomes, on people being fitter for longer in their older age, etc. So I have a concern about the provision of services. A lot of services now are provided by third sector who are facing a financial squeeze. You know, none of us here are idiots. We all understand the absolute pressure, A, the NHS is under, and B, the financial element of it is under. But, you know, you're clearly setting out to achieve an objective, and it seems to me that you're putting in place sort of A through to X, but you're not doing the final bit, or that I'm not yet, I wait to be convinced by you, Cabinet Secretary, that you've looked at what Z should be, that you've looked at, you know, what the services should be, you've identified the lack of services, or if we have enough. You haven't actually said if you think we actually have enough throughout the whole of Wales in a consistent, equitable way. If at least you've done that work, and even if you turn around and say, oh, but I need another, you know, 20 million to do it and I haven't got it today, at least we know it's there, that the thought process is there, the plan is there, so that if we can then get to a point where we can fund it, we can fund it. But I don't want to see that we've done this bit of the equation and not really had a good look at it, because there's such fragility in the third sector as well. that, you know, some of our support services for people with drug and alcohol problems, if they fall apart, then, you know, it's just the whole thing becomes an exercise that is ultimately rather pointless.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we have looked at our current ability to service the needs of people. That's why we've made choices about protecting frontline services. We're actually seeing an improving trend in waiting times in the substance misuse field, and the choice we made have actually increased the amount for frontline services. That's the choice that we're already making. So we do think we've actually planned and tried to understand what current levels of demand are and what the future might be. But there's something about this that isn't predictable, because whilst we may see more people looking to acquire help, we also think that some people will moderate their behaviour, and so you potentially avoid those people coming in, as that's part of the point of passing the legislation, to change people's behaviour in itself. So at this point, I think we're in a position where we've increased funding to the front line. We try to understand what we need to do that. We do then have to look at the evidence coming into us then as well to make other choices. And even when you have a plan moving forward, you can't pretend that isn't a dynamic process that changes as evidence comes into it, where it is and where we are. And that, of course, means a grown-up conversation between the third sector and between the statutory sector and our other partners as well. So that's where we are now in trying to design and deliver a substance misuse strategy that delivers against the real needs that we recognise exist in every part of the country. The choices made in the budget support that. And we need to think about how we continue to do that in the future with a very challenging financial climate, as you recognise.
We had 52 responses to the consultation from other bodies. I haven't read every single one, but I have read a lot of them. Every single one of the ones that I have read, and as I say, I've read a lot of them, say that this will not work without having adequate support. So I absolutely just have to keep pressing you on this, because I think it is vital that it's not just, it's about mental health support, it's about the addiction behaviour, the health boards who've all replied have all said we need to have more support services in place. The primary care people, we need to have more services in place. The doctors, the psychologists, and then we've had, Alcohol Focus Scotland. We had the Quaker Action on Alcohol and Drugs. Pick out those two because they do drugs and alcohol. They talk about extra support services. The Public Health Wales, England. So I suppose my last set of questions is do you intend to commission either a dedicated evaluation on it, or are you doing any other research or evaluation on this bill, on whether or not you've got all the other parts of the jigsaw in place and enough funding to do it? Or are you saying, right, we've done everything, this is it, we're just going to go ahead with the bill?
Yeah, let's trace to talk about what area planning boards already do with current, and then trying to meet future needs as well.
Okay. I think when the Minister mentioned the resources that Welsh Government provided to 7 area planning boards in Wales, and they're the bodies, partnership bodies, responsible for commissioning and delivering local substance misuse services. Now that's done on the basis of a robust needs assessment. So I think the point we would make is the need in a local area for whatever, and it is combined, it's drugs and alcohol need, would be picked up in the needs assessment, and then the services, many of which, well, half actually of which are provided by third sector providers, then meet that local need. That's the way in which the system, if you like, works. As the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, for 18-19, the resources that the Welsh Government are providing to the area planning boards has been protected for 18-19. And I think the other point that I would want to make is that we're in very regular quarterly formal meetings, very, very regular contact with area planning board leads. So my team regularly, for instance, attend all area planning board meetings, and also we have formal meetings with those. I chair a meeting of the chairs twice a year, together with those quarterly lead officer meetings. So we've got a very, I would say, very tight handle on what they're doing, what services they're providing, and in fact, the services that they provide through the individual projects come into Welsh Government. My team assess those, and then agree the award of funding. So it's an agenda that's fairly tightly controlled, I would say, from our perspective. And the point relating to the bill I would want to make is that obviously we've already started talking to them about any unintended or other consequences arising from the bill.
Okay. Rhian, you had a supplementary on this point before?
Yes, it was on this point and on the effect on dependent drinkers, but picking up on what we discussed earlier about the financial implications, there will clearly be a financial implication for dependent drinkers who currently spend £3.50 on a large bottle of white cider and who will then have to and will feel compelled to spend £11.50 on the same bottle because they will have to have the bottle. Unless there is a new approach to targeting dependent drinkers and giving those dependent drinkers assistance to deal with their addiction. In reviewing the explanatory memorandum, is there room to give a clearer undertaking to review the way dependent drinkers are addressed, or dependent drinking is addressed as a... It's not quite an unintended consequence of the bill. It is a consequence, and it's kind of intended if it helps them bring them off alcohol.
Well, I'm not sure the explanatory memorandum is the place to do it. I don't think getting back to some of the questions Julie Morgan was arguing about the place of dependent drinkers and the evaluation of impact or not. And I think that's a slightly different piece of policy work, but it is a piece of policy work that we would want to do, because there is a study that is going to take place in Scotland. Part of their work is looking at dependent drinkers, and we'd again want to look at that. Scotland actually have a bigger alcohol problem than we do, and so they were particularly interested in this area of work. So we are definitely interested in the study they will undertake. And actually there are very constructive and regular relationships between the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government on the piece of legislation and our approaches to evaluation. So we are deliberately setting out to learn as much as possible. So on a policy undertaking, rather than trying to think about the piece of legislation, then yes, of course we want to understand what impact, if any, would this piece of legislation have, and what do we then need to do about our services, bearing in mind what you've just heard about the way in which we look to meet the need that exists in each of the areas of Wales where we have that partnership with area planning boards, and the way in which those services are provided. So, and that then comes into budget choice we make as well. So these are things around this area, and that's why I say this bill needs to be seen in context.
And I think
in context of all the action we're looking to take.
That's very useful, and I don't think this is something that we would expect to be in the bill, but in the selling of this legislation to people, which is very, very important. It's very important, I'm sure you'd agree, to get the narrative right about, what the intention is and what response there will be to the consequences of bringing in this bill. And I think the more clarity we have from yourself and Welsh Government about the assessments, the evaluations that are going to be made, the more useful it will be in terms of dealing with some of the perceptions of the bill.
Well, we've tried to put that clarity about the review, about the evaluation, about what to understand the real needs and the impact, if there is going to be an impact on substitution, the work we've already got in train to try and deal, and also the work on trying to understand and dynamically plan for and meet the need that exists in the broader substance misuse field as well, including people who are dependent on substance misuse. So, we recognise those challenges and want to try and make sure that's done in a way that's coherent, and the bill is recognised as being able to contribute to part of the harm that alcohol causes. There's other work to do about persuading people to think again about their relationship with alcohol.
Okay. Angela, did you want to come back?
No.
You're done? Happy? Great. Symud ymlaen felly, cwestiynau second, Jane, Brian.
The impact of the industry and retailers. I understand that there's going to be a meeting between Welsh Government officials and the Welsh Retail Consortium happening in the new year. Has that already happened, or is it due to?
It was due to, but at the request of the retailers, some of them weren't able to attend the original date. That's been rearranged. So it will still happen this month, and obviously we'll try and make sure that people are informed. If there is something useful that we can say from that meeting, because it is an important conversation to have. Not every retailer is in exactly the same position on the proposal, and we want to try and talk to retailers as a group about not just about the successful implementation of this legislation. They're not all in favour of it, but also other questions have been raised about what might happen after a new regime comes into place.
Thank you. Have you considered in detail the imposition of a compulsory levy or a voluntary contribution scheme for retailers? And are you able to provide any update on the potential for a levy or voluntary scheme from your discussions with the retailers?
I'm not convinced that we would actually have the powers to impose a levy. And the challenge about a voluntary levy is, of course, it is voluntary. And I think that the challenge then gets into, are we looking to raise revenue on the back of this as a government? And that might take away from some of the drives. Is this really a revenue-raising measure, or is it really a public health measure? And we're very clear it's a public health measure. Well, there is a conversation to be had, and it'll be part of the conversation that officials have with retailers, about if the model evidence is right, and this results in there being additional profit being made by retailers, in particular the larger retailers, what then happens? And I think some retailers may take a different view about what they would then do. Every retailer will say that it takes its corporate social responsibility seriously. People in this room and outside may say that some of them have a more generous approach to that corporate social responsibility than others. And I think actually having some in principle discussions now is the right thing to do. And we then get into wanting to have evidence about if there's an increase in profit, can we identify it, and can we then get to the position where practically we're looking to have a voluntary contribution back, and what would that be? Would it be in general areas of corporate social responsibility? Would it be about something we want you to make a contribution back to how actually you're part of helping to fund people to have a sensible relationship with alcohol or not? So that relationship isn't complete, that conversation isn't complete, and I don't think it will be complete actually until we get into having more real-world evidence of what's happened. And again, it's where I think Scotland will be for us as well, because they'll be going through this first, and I know they want to have that conversation with retailers too. And again, you'd have thought that for UK-wide retail, and I won't publicise individual ones, but if they're having that conversation in Scotland, it'd be rather difficult to avoid having it here. And others, people like Co-op and Waitrose may be in a different position to say other retailers about their willingness to have that conversation. But we'll have to talk to them as a group and decide what we can do, if anything at all, and what we can do on a voluntary basis, and to think about what powers we do or don't have on anything that's compulsory. But the compulsory levy is something that is a different piece of legislation, I think, as well. So when you think about what that might or might not look like.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Before you go on, Jen, could I just clarify, in terms of, obviously, the plastic bag levy and the 5p has gone to environmental causes, could not the same principle apply here? Those retailers that are going to make a profit from this minimum unit alcohol pricing, there are various figures banded about, but it would be an easier selling point for the whole legislation if you say, right, okay, any profit from minimum alcohol pricing actually goes to alcohol substance misuse services, for instance.
Scotland, interestingly, on basic supermarkets, they introduced a levy for a period of time on the basis of selling lots of tobacco and alcohol. And it got moved away, partly because they couldn't demonstrate that the revenue that came in was hypothecated to go into that particular purpose. So the challenge to the government about revenue and where that then goes if it's raised. There's also a challenge about understanding what is a differential level of profit. If you look at a supermarket's profit and what it does and doesn't declare, if it says, actually, we made a loss this year, but you say, but actually, even within your losses, you gained more income from this measure coming in Wales, that's rather difficult to then go out and address. And it's also then the challenge of whether we're really talking about the levelling on plastic bags was for a different purpose. This would really, there'd be arguments about, is this just a different form of taxation or not? It's a conversation I don't think we should shut off, but I don't want to try and set out for the government a position, or indeed for the finance sector a position, on what we might or might not want to do in that area. I think let's get the public health gain to be made from this piece of legislation on the statute books. Let's make sure that's there, and let's continue to have a conversation about how we then get retailers into a position where not only are they not so hostile to what we want to do, but also we can try and think about how we then have a more grown-up conversation about their responsibilities as large-scale retailers of alcohol.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair. You've mentioned your hope already this morning that the bill would provide an opportunity perhaps to encourage manufacturers to produce lower strength alcohol, and others have mentioned that to us. what feedback has the Welsh Government received from the industry about the potential to reformulate existing products and produce a larger range of lower strength alcohol products?
They have yet to come back to us to disclose the way in which they're able to change their business model and what they do and don't do. We'll ask them, but I'm not confident they'll tell us that they are committed to doing something different. Apart from nothing else, a number of those retailers at the moment are not in favour of the legislation as it is. But there's a clear difference in price. You know, a beer, lager or cider that is 4% compared to 5%, there's a 25% difference in the price of a 500 ml bottle or can of that product. And that makes a difference to the people making choices as you go up and down an aisle. But actually, I'm not persuaded it makes much difference to taste. When I drink, as I I consider myself to be a moderate drinker most of the time. Price makes a difference to me, but actually, if you ask me about the taste and my enjoyment of something that was 5% or 4%, I can honestly tell you that there was a radical difference in itself. So there's something for the industry to consider, and not these are commercial considerations. And they'll simply make a judgment about what they want to do and what niche and what area of the market they see themselves as being in. Some producers won't make any difference at all. Others may think again about the way in which they promote different products. And I hope actually it'll be part of changing our broader conversation, you know, in terms of low strength, generally low strength products as well. In different countries in Europe in particular, there's a very different attitude to either zero or very low strength alcohol as well, and the way in which it's sold, marketed and produced in exactly the same way alongside branded alcohol products as well.
Okay, thank you. We've had some written evidence from ASDA, and they've talked about altering its pricing system in preparation for the Scottish legislation, and that cost is in excess of £1 million. How confident are you that the estimates in the regulatory impact assessment are robust?
I think they're robust and reasonable, and I would suggest that we should take with a pinch of salt a large retailer like Asda or others who are suggesting there will be an enormous cost to changing the price of a range of products. Asda themselves change prices on a regular basis. You see, different, you say rollback, price cut, it's not difficult for them to do that in individual stores or across the country. Every time there is a budget and whoever is the government of the day changes taxation on products, by the next day they're able to manage that and to deal with it, and they don't ever say, don't you dare change alcohol taxes on this particular day and require us to do it within a period of time that costs us far too much money. So I take it with a pinch of salt, and actually, of course, you haven't had the opportunity to test that, do you? Because they and other retailers I know haven't accepted your invitation to give oral evidence. So we'll consider their view in writing, but I'm not persuaded there's a need to change our assessment of the impact of this piece of legislation.
You've mentioned that there's a difference between bigger retailers and smaller ones. How do you feel that you would work with both large and smaller companies and retailers to minimise implementation of costs where possible for them?
Well, again, even smaller retailers, when it comes to changing their stock and changing their price, they're able to do so. They're either voluntarily because they want to change the price of goods they have, they want to clear stock out, or indeed if they're affected by changes made in a UK budget on taxes and duties on alcohol. There's a different sort of challenge about wanting to make sure that retailers understand their duties. And so when you think about local authorities and the conversations we've had with them, they recognise that most of their work is likely to be with those smaller retailers in terms of them understanding their new duties under the legislation should the Assembly pass it, rather than having to have a long and difficult conversation with a large-scale supermarket provider as well. So I think it's a reasonable basis to have the conversation, and the cost which will be provided for both smaller and larger retailers too.
We've looking at Section 6 of the bill, where alcohol is supplied with other products, so things such as meal deals, which are quite prevalent now. It's been identified and suggested to us that this could be a loophole where retailers could potentially exploit. What steps do you feel that the Welsh Government could take to minimise the opportunities for these loopholes?
I don't think it actually is a loophole. We've tried to do this to try and avoid people using meal deals to sell alcohol below the minimum unit price. And so what we set out is that we would stop people from being able to do that. So if, for example, you had a a meal deal that's £4.50 and included a bottle of wine, and when we'd say, well, actually, that can't be a meal deal including a bottle of wine because you're avoiding the minimum unit price in doing so. And that's what Section 6 sets out. So that is something that's coming in writing. We'll consider it in terms of if there's a drafting issue, but I don't think, I think it's exactly the opposite. Section 6 is there to avoid people using a meal deal to sell alcohol below the minimum price.
Okay, you've mentioned you want to learn as much as possible from what's happening in Scotland, quite rightly. What consideration has the Welsh Government given to the need for consistent minimum pricing regimes in the UK? And you say you're in close discussion with them on a number of things. I presume that will keep going throughout this process?
Yeah. Well, despite the differing politics of the two governments, actually, between officials and on some of the policy agenda, there is, as I say, a constructive engagement about where we are. I would prefer it if there was a consistent UK-wide approach to minimum unit pricing. The big challenge with that is England, actually, because the United Kingdom government are watching, waiting, and look at the evidence. Initially, when I first came into this department as a deputy minister, the UK were actually quite hostile. And I remember having a conversation with a Home Office minister who was very clear that he did not want to take any action on this because he was worried about the impact on the nighttime economy, which I thought was rather odd, because actually if you're going out and drinking alcohol in a premises, then actually alcohol that's sold at below the current indicative level is very cheap indeed. I think there's been some movement, but I wouldn't say that either the Department for Health and their colleagues across the Home Office and other parts of government are in a position where enthusiastic about it. But should, as again, the devolved nations lead in an area, it's entirely possible England will eventually catch up, and the plastic bag levy is a good example. I'm also not persuaded that we need to set out a position where if another country makes a choice, we will automatically follow. We need to think about how we understand our own evidence about what the impact should be in practical terms as well as a health gain. As I say, we want to promote the opportunity to learn from each other, which we're doing actively with Scotland. We will have a proper, objective, evidence-led approach to how we set a minimum unit price that Assembly members will have to vote on. And if there is to be a confluence between the different nations in the UK on this, well, that would have to come between grown-up conversations between politicians and different governments.
Yes, well, Westminster has obviously also followed us, not just on plastic bags, but also on the smoking ban as well, really.
Indeed, on a range of measures. And I think they'll do so again on a number of, there's a public health areas where they're reluctant and eventually end up following what we've done.
Yes, they see
it's a good thing.
It is a good thing, absolutely. Devolution spin-off. Last questions are from Dawn.
Well, thank you, Chair. Cabinet Secretary, I think we talked about the online sales earlier and the impact of that. I think you've clarified the position around that. I just want to deal now specifically with cross-border sales that are not online and the potential impact that might have around Welsh business and jobs. You know, we share a very long border with England. People like me have family that live just over the border, and by the end of the year we're going to be losing the bridge tolls, so it's going to be cheaper to go over there, and so on and so forth. So have you just given any kind of consideration to the potential impact, not just on the sales, but on you know, potentially on businesses and jobs that maybe people going across the border to buy alcohol might have?
Yeah, look, the cross-border issue is real, if not especially in a piece of legislation. We do share a large border, and there are communities that have easy flow between the two for, if you like, normal retail activities. When we think about that, we're really talking the off-licence trade, because actually, if you're talking about buying at a licensed premises, you know, I think people are going to run down the road to go and drink in a different pub. I think that there are different choices made, and in any event, we actually think it will have a beneficial impact for the pub trade, because the differential in price between products in other retailers will be lessened. And again, this comes back to the challenge of, do we really think that we'll see a significant change in people's behaviour, that they will look to go over the border in terms of transport and in terms of their time? It goes to the point of making an answer to Lincoln. And there isn't lots of evidence that you'll see large flows of people looking to avoid the impact of the legislation and continuing with harmful or hazardous behaviour. We think with the patterns in which people currently adopt, that's not normally the way people do things. And it's more about convenience than anything else, actually. You may be able to give specific examples where it is convenient to do so, but you come back then to the challenge that is one particular example where it might be convenient to do so a good reason not to take action where there is significant public health gain to be made. So I don't want to dismiss you and say there is nothing to see here, but actually I think it's overplayed as an issue. You need to think about the real impact on people's behaviour and convenience, the time and cost involved in going across the border, and actually not forgetting the fact this is a public health piece of legislation.
Understand that. And presumably that would be part of your impact assessment as well, as, in terms of how much is going across the board. That's fine. This is interesting because given your answer just now on Asda's evidence, you might also think this is spurious because it did cross my mind that it probably was, actually. Because one of the things that Asda have flagged up is their concern about the environmental impacts of surplus stock that they might have to,
champions of the environment.
to get rid of. Yeah. So, you know, I'll ask you anyway what your views on that might be.
Well, again, at this point in time, retailers, particularly larger retailers like that, are particularly adept at getting rid of surplus stock. Either in cutting...
It's packaging particularly, I think. They're
packaging, but there'll be a long time for them to get used to this.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking now about passing a piece of legislation for a regime that won't come into place if the Assembly passes the bill, and it becomes an act until July 2019. There'll be consultations to run about the minimum unit price before that as well. Just not as if we're talking about a measure that, say, on budget day, you potentially have something that changes for midnight on the day the statement is made. We're talking about something where they'll have actually more than a year's notice of what we're looking to do, and then very specific notice of what that regime will be. And again, I would take with a pinch of salt the idea that there is going to be a lake of unusable alcohol or a mountain of plastic bottles building up somewhere that poor old Asda, with its limited means, can't possibly get rid of. And there's a significant environmental impact of. I would not say that that is at the more realistic end of the risks that we run with this piece of legislation.
Okay, thank you for that. Final question from me around additional measures. And in the answer you gave to Angela earlier on around dealing with alcohol treatment services, I think you covered that. But we've also heard stakeholders talking about the need for other measures which might involve you having discussions with the UK government about things that obviously we don't have competence in. But that those could be around health warning levels, restricting alcohol sales in alcohol advertising, legal blood alcohol concentration, and strengthening the licensing system, none of which we have particular competence around. Have you given thought to discussions with the UK government about how some of those areas might be strengthened to assist the bill?
Yes, it's part of an ongoing conversation with the UK government on things like advertising, where there are conversations across UK nations about alcohol advertising, not just about where adverts are placed, but actually advertising on the products themselves as well. There's an ongoing conversation. Our view is that we think that there is health gain to be made in reducing the alcohol limits for driving, to have a similar measure to Scotland. That's consistent, actually, with the advice of the 4 CMOs. They recommended that's the right thing to do. We don't have competence to do that, and it's the UK government that is not keen or is not prepared at present to change that, to have a consistent limit of 15 milligrams across the UK. We think that would definitely reduce alcohol harm. It would, again, change people's behaviour in the understanding that there really is a very small amount of alcohol you could possibly drink before we can safely get into a car. Not just about how people then behave when they're drinking, but also about not wanting people behind the wheel of a car on a motorbike potentially when they should not be. So there's a range of non-devolved areas. We do continue to have conversations with the United Kingdom government and obviously Public Health Wales and England, have regular conversations where the 4 CMOs talk about these issues as well. In addition, there are things that we do have some control over and we want to do. So thinking about your drinking campaign, at the start of this week, again encouraging people to think again about drinking after most of us had perhaps more than we otherwise have done in the festive period, as long as we haven't been ill in bed, and then thinking again about what we then do, and that's alongside the Dry January campaign and making use of our pharmacy network to have those brief conversations as well. So there's lots of things we want to do that are outside the bill that we can do, as well as a continuing conversation with the UK government on areas that are not currently devolved, and where we still think there's gain to be made.
So you're looking to utilise all the levers that you have,
yes,
to assist this, but continuing the conversations with the UK government on the wider issues that we don't have competence in.
Correct.
Thank you.
Just as a supplementary, I mean, we've had a legal note that seems to suggest that alcohol advertising we can do something about in the Assembly.
Yeah,
because it comes under food and drink,
yeah.
And so we could do something about alcohol
well,
advertising. Are you looking to do something?
Well, there is an active conversation, for example, about labelling on products. That's what I mentioned.
Yeah.
And there's a conversation between all of the UK nations about what we might do about that. If we wanted to promote a piece of legislation on it, you would undoubtedly, I think, have a challenge. But it is an area that we would want to consider what we might want to do in the future. But there is an active conversation between the four governments at present on that particular issue.
Right, okay.
Just on advertising, it's very complicated in terms of our powers in that area. So we are looking at that, but as Cabinet has mentioned, that's an active conversation that we're having with lawyers at the moment, because it's not a straightforward competence in that area. I think, Bethan, that would be a fair reflection, given the exceptions.
Well, there's various issues at play. So there's, in addition to the carve-out for food, there is other exceptions to have to consider.
Such as
for
broadcasting, for example.
So it very much would depend what you wanted to do and the detail of the provision. But there is an area.
Absolutely, the issue about labelling on food and the drink is covered as part of food. There's then the point about whether it goes into advertising and other areas as well, where actually the division in powers is still not as clear as we would want it to be.
Right.
But there is an active conversation. This isn't an area where the UK government is simply saying, no, we absolutely do not want to talk about this. Because I think there's been a bit of a shift, and there's a greater recognition and some willingness to think about how we could have more coordinated action on actually to reduce some of these public health harms. You know, if you think about the responsibility deal, well, the UK government recognised it didn't really work. It didn't really produce the gain they wanted it to. And so I think there's a shift in an understanding that we may need to do some things that are not about encouragement and praise for people, but actually wanted to do some different things that might involve legislative action as well.
Okay, unrhyw gwestiynau eraill? Pawb yn hapus, lle datgan felly bod y sesiwn gwestiwn yma ar ben, lle diolch yn fawr iawn i'r ysgrifennydd y Cabinet a swyddogion am eu presenoldeb, a hefyd am ateb y cwestiynau, ac am bob tystiolaeth arall, a lle hefyd bellach ddweud fyddwch chi'n derbyn trawsgrifiad fel chi'n gwybod o'r cyfarfod yma o'r trafodaethau mwyn i chi gadarnhau bod nhw yn ffeithiol gywir. Ond gyda hynna, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, a nhw'n ni symud ymlaen i'r eitem nesaf. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch Cadeirydd.
Ac felly, eitem 3, papurau wnodi, bydd aelodau wedi darllen llythyrau o dan papurau wnodi gan y Gymdeithas Physiotherapy, llythyr gan Age Cymru, llythyr gan Gymdeithas Alzheimer, a gwybodaeth ychwanegol gan Alcohol Concern Cymru, ac hefyd llythyr gan yr ysgrifennydd Cabinet dros Iechyd a Chwaraeon ynghylch cymhellion hyfforddi meddygon teulu. Hapus i nodi neu unrhyw bwynt i'w godi? Pawb yn hapus. Eitem 4, felly cynnig o dan reol sefydlog 17.42, benderfynu gwahardd y cyhoedd o weddill y cyfarfod. Pawb yn gytun i droi fewn i sesiwn breifat. Diolch yn fawr.